This is the mural wall in Black Diamond Square, Port Adelaide, South Australia. I'm about to cover up this work by local artist Jason Hahn, with his permission, and paint my own mural to celebrate the release of my new film, Psychosis. It's going to be weird, it's going to be cool, and it's going to glow in the dark. My name's Pirie. I wrote and directed Psychosis, and when I'm not making films, I'm also an artist, but I've never painted a mural before. So I enlisted the help of local mural painter John Whitney, as well as my dad, who is also an artist and also named John. John, that's John Whitney, recommended we should work from a grid to transfer the image to the wall. So I took measurements at the location and translated them into Photoshop. Here I am doing more math than I've done in maybe 10 years. And yes, I made a mistake. You'll see why in a minute, but I quickly fixed the issue and the wall ended up perfectly dividing into an even grid of 30 centimeter squares. The brief I was working with was simple: black, white, and red, something interactive, something that represents the themes of the film, but also something that stands on its own as a unique work of art. Another important consideration was that because I'm trying to promote a horror thriller film, I needed to be careful not to create a piece of public art that would scare kids or make some people sick while on their lunch break. So it had to be something the council would actually approve of. Here you can see me trying to draw hands with some very extreme perspective by hand, which was a bit of a struggle. So I start cheating. Well, not really, but I saved a lot of time by taking some reference photos with a wide lens and tracing them, which was a lot easier than trying to contort my hands as a live reference while I was drawing. I swapped their position and poses quite a lot, trying to get the best arrangements of shapes and perspectives, trying to make sure that the fingers don't become a confusing mess. Swap these over, move them, different hand options here and there. This design highlights the hypnotism and optical illusions that are a big part of the style of Psychosis. I wanted the image to be attention-grabbing and interactive, so I settled on the idea of making it look three-dimensional, as if the villain of the film, Jubini, was reaching out of a hypnotic vortex to grab you with hands that could also look like he's puppeteering your limbs, which I thought might look good for selfies. It took me a few attempts to make sense of the curved arm. It looked kind of silly and exaggerated, until I realized it wasn't the arm, it was actually the character's pose. Once I fixed that, I could make the arm more simple, and I think overall it looks more dynamic, maybe has more movement. I also paid close attention to the shape of the spiral lines in this early stage because it's a lot easier to adjust digitally, and some of the perspective effects are unforgiving, and I knew getting it right here would make the painting much easier. You can see how sharp and narrow these lines get when they're bending around a deep curve. I found that was something that my brain didn't necessarily picture easily unless I was working from a reference. And if it's not done right, then the depth effect doesn't work properly, everything looks really flat. So this is the final design. As you can see at the top, I have 3 panels that extend above the wall, and those are what was throwing off my calculations earlier on. Those panels are based on the measurements of some extra wood that I had available. And so the next step was to transfer these top parts of the design onto the boards and then cut the shapes down to size. These are a fun detail that I hope will make the design look like it's popping out of the wall and enhance the 3D effect even more. And finally we get to the wall itself. The first step was gluing and nailing up the boards, making sure that I hammered enough nails that they don't fly off in the sea winds and hit somebody. Luckily, in the end, half of the background is going to remain white. Our hope was that we could just keep the white priming coat as the background and then paint very carefully, which would mean that after our prep day, the spirals are effectively half finished. The next day, John Whitney came down to offer some handy advice on transferring the grid design. He would normally do this by himself and gaffer tape his measuring tape onto the wall while he worked. But there were 3 of us on site for this job, which made things a lot easier and a lot quicker. So once we'd gridded up, the Johns and I upscaled the design onto the wall using pencil. Because of the spirals, it was actually really difficult to tell which square was which on the grid, so there was a lot of hopping back and forth to double or triple check everything. We pretty quickly realized as well that the spirals themselves would be an absolute living hell to draw with the pencil, and to keep track of what strips are black and which ones are white. So we decided to leave the bulk of that for later, using the design more as a guide rather than a super strict reference. It was also tricky getting Jubini's face to look the right amount of scary or spooky and not like he was smiling, but I might leave it to you to decide if we succeeded at that. The original design for the character Jubini was created by another artist friend of mine, Andrew Coleman. He's also responsible for the brilliant idea to use glow-in-the-dark paint later on. It was great having the two Johns helping out because we ended up creating a production line which sped up the process quite a lot. I would block out the design and make sure that the spirals were alternating black and white correctly and curving the right way to create the optical illusion. And they would follow along behind me and fill in the color or touch up the details. There was a fun chunk of one day where my brain's trust behind the scenes mentioned that the big red hands were looking a little bit flat and maybe could use some shading. I wasn't sure if doing blended shadows would work with the glow paint, so I decided to try some cross-hatching instead. I spent a good while painting them, only for the brain's trust to turn around and say, actually, now that I've seen it, it looked a bit better before. So here I am repainting that. But you do have to experiment with these things sometimes. And as I made my way further down into the vortex, things got quite finicky and repetitive with these tiny thin lines, which I found I got into a bit of a rhythm, but I just switched my brain off and eventually I didn't really notice the passage of time. Finally, the mural was complete, except for one final detail. I had no idea if it was going to work. It's something I've definitely never tried before, and it was a complete experiment. But this is phosphorescent paint, which glows under a UV blacklight, and my hope was that it would create an interactive crime scene effect after dark. I had to order this stuff from Interstate, and I wasn't really sure how much to get. It came in these small 250ml bottles, which I assumed would be enough to cover all of the red of Jubini. I did some tests to check the coverage, and also how thick I needed to apply it. And it turns out that while it goes on quite thin, it actually glows really well under the blacklight. And it only needed one thin, even coat. I just had to be careful to avoid clumps and streaks. On Jubini's face, I actually did play around with deliberately leaving some lumps to create a bit of a 3D effect where his gloopy kind of features protrude a little bit more. I also painted the palm of his hand a lot thinner than the fingers and hands in front, which I hoped would make them glow a little bit brighter and pop out a little bit more. The only issue working with this paint is that it doesn't glow clearly during the day. And I was painting red on red, very thin, very evenly, so it was incredibly difficult to tell if I'd missed a spot. You could just tell where I've painted by it being slightly brighter or slightly more orange, but I would have to wait until nighttime to check. And I didn't really want to come back again the next day. So to be certain, I had to paint kind of like a scanner, being very careful not to get too impatient and risk missing anything. Then there was the problem of weatherproofing the mural and waterproofing it. If it rained, all of this paint was just going to come straight off. But you have to be very careful choosing a sealant or a varnish because all of the outdoor varnishes or exterior grade varnishes available are UV protecting, which would have meant that if you shone your UV torch at it at night, it would completely block and it wouldn't glow at all. So in the end, we opted for an interior matte varnish just to keep it safe enough from wind and rain. I think there is definitely a reason why outdoor murals don't usually go down the road of using glow-in-the-dark paint. I don't think this is something that is going to stand the test of time. But it does look really cool. I was so proud of how this turned out. So much of this process was an experiment and a first time for me as an artist. So to see it come together like this was really rewarding. And if you think this is cool, then you should definitely check out Psychosis.